What others say about us in our absence often feels like it is revealing a hidden truth, but psychologically, it is far more revealing of the speaker's inner world than of our actual identity. When a person talks about someone who is not present, they are not simply reporting facts. They are interpreting, filtering, and reconstructing that person through memory, emotion, bias, and current psychological state. Every human mind works like a symbolic editing system, not a recording device. It does not replay reality exactly as it happened. It reprocesses it. So when someone describes you, they are not accessing you as you are, but you as they experienced, remembered, and emotionally encoded you. This becomes even more pronounced in emotionally charged relationships, especially love or attachment, where perception is heavily influenced by desire, fear, insecurity, admiration, or disappointment. In such states, the mind tends to amplify certain traits and minimize others. A person who feels deeply connected to you may unconsciously idealize your actions, attributing intention or depth that may not objectively exist in every moment. On the other hand, someone who feels hurt or uncertain may interpret neutral behavior as rejection or distance. In both cases, the you being described is partially real but heavily shaped by emotional projection. Projection is a key psychological mechanism here. It means the mind places its own unprocessed emotions, expectations, and internal conflicts onto another person. So when someone speaks about you, they may unknowingly be speaking about themselves at the same time. For example, if they say you are distant, it may reflect their own fear of abandonment or sensitivity to emotional space. If they describe you as intense, it may reflect their own discomfort with depth or emotional exposure. The language they use becomes a mirror, not just a label. Memory distortion also plays a role. Human memory is reconstructive, meaning it changes every time it is recalled. Over time, stories about a person become simplified narratives rather than accurate recordings. Details that do not fit the emotional theme are dropped, while details that reinforce it are strengthened. So when someone retells their perception of you, they are often retelling a refined emotional version of events rather than the events themselves. Social context further influences this process. People rarely speak in psychological isolation. When talking to others about you, they may adjust their narrative to gain validation, avoid vulnerability, or maintain a certain self-image. The way you are described can shift depending on who is listening and what emotional outcome the speaker unconsciously seeks. This means the same person can be described in multiple, even contradictory ways, depending on context. What emerges from all of this is a layered truth. What others say about us is never a direct reflection of who we are, but a composite of their perception, emotional state, memory reconstruction, and social positioning. The real identity of a person exists beneath these layers, but it is never fully transmitted through speech alone. What reaches us is always filtered reality, shaped as much by the speaker's psychology as by our actual presence in their life. The idea of you that exists inside someone else's mind is never a direct copy of who you actually are. It is a constructed psychological model formed through fragments of experience, emotion, interpretation, and imagination. When someone meets you, they do not absorb your full reality. They observe limited behaviors, hear selective words, witness specific emotional states, and then their mind begins assembling those fragments into a coherent identity. That assembled identity becomes you inside their perception, but it is always incomplete and shaped by their internal psychology as much as by your actual behavior. Every person carries internal frameworks based on past relationships, emotional conditioning, attachment patterns, and personal fears. These frameworks act like invisible filters through which new people are understood. So when someone thinks about you, they are not thinking in a vacuum. They are mapping you onto existing emotional templates. If they have experienced inconsistency in the past, they may interpret neutral distance from you as unpredictability. If they have experienced emotional neglect, they may read silence as rejection. If they have experienced idealized love, they may inflate your positive traits beyond reality. In each case, the you they construct is partially built from their history, not just your presence. This internal version of you also changes over time. Memory is not static, it is reconstructive. Each time they recall you, the memory is slightly rewritten based on their current emotional state. If they miss you, the memory becomes warmer and more idealized. If they feel hurt, the memory becomes sharper and more critical. This means the version of you living in their mind is not fixed. It is continuously evolving based on emotional conditions rather than objective truth. Imagination also fills in the gaps where knowledge is missing. No one can fully know another person's inner world, so the mind automatically completes the unknown with assumptions. These assumptions often feel like intuition, but they are actually projections of what the mind expects or fears. So the imagined version of you is a blend of real interactions and invisible storytelling. Over time, this storytelling becomes so consistent that it feels like truth to the person holding it. Language plays a powerful role in solidifying this internal model. When someone talks about you, they are not just describing you, they are reinforcing their own constructed version of you. Each sentence they say strengthens certain traits and weakens others in their mental representation. Repetition turns interpretation into belief, and belief turns into identity. At that point, the you they refer to is no longer flexible. It becomes a psychological object shaped by narrative rather than reality. What makes this even more complex is that emotional attachment intensifies this construction. The more someone cares, the more detailed and emotionally charged their internal version of you becomes. They begin to relate not just to who you are, but to what you represent in their emotional world. You become associated with safety, uncertainty, desire, or loss, depending on how the relationship is experienced internally. These associations can become stronger than factual accuracy, so the you inside someone else's mind is never singular or stable. It is a living psychological structure built from perception, emotion, memory distortion, projection, and imagination, continuously rewritten by time and feeling, existing alongside but separate from your actual identity in reality. Love intensifies projection because it lowers the psychological distance between two people and increases emotional investment, which causes the mind to blend perception with internal experience rather than keeping them separate. In ordinary interactions, people can usually distinguish between what they observe and what they assume. But in emotional attachment, especially romantic attraction or deep bonding, that boundary becomes less stable. The other person stops being experienced only as an external individual and starts becoming a psychological space where inner needs, fears, desires, and unresolved patterns are placed and reflected back. Projection happens when the mind uses another person as a surface onto which it places its own internal content. This content can include unmet emotional needs, idealized fantasies, fears of abandonment, or even aspects of identity that are not fully conscious. In love, this process becomes stronger because emotional intensity reduces critical distance. The more emotionally significant someone becomes, the more the brain prioritizes meaning-making over neutral observation. Instead of simply registering behavior, the mind begins interpreting behavior as symbolic, as if every action contains hidden emotional significance. The person becomes a symbolic figure representing safety, validation, transformation, or emotional completion. This symbolic layer sits on top of the real person, and over time it can become more influential than actual interaction. The loved individual is then experienced not only as who they are, but as what they represent internally. At the same time, projection can also work in the opposite direction through fear-based distortion. If emotional vulnerability feels risky, the mind may project doubt, suspicion, or anticipated loss onto the relationship. This can create emotional highs and lows that feel like they are caused by the other person, but are actually generated internally through shifting projections. What makes love uniquely powerful in intensifying projection is that it activates both attachment systems and imagination simultaneously. Attachment seeks closeness and security, while imagination fills uncertainty with narrative. Together, they create a deeply immersive internal experience where perception is continuously shaped by emotional needs. The other person becomes a mirror reflecting not just who they are, but the evolving inner world of the one who loves them. Hearing that someone you love has disgust you creates a psychological collision because it forces two different systems in the mind to activate at the same time: the external reality of what was said and the internal imagination of what you thought existed between you. These two systems do not naturally align, and when they meet, the mind experiences tension, uncertainty, and rapid meaning-making. The reason it feels so intense is not only because of curiosity, but because it disrupts the stability of the relationship as it exists in your internal world. Before hearing anything, you already carry a mental model of the relationship. This model is built from direct interactions, emotional moments, silence, expectations, and interpretations. It feels coherent because it is internally constructed and continuously reinforced by memory and feeling. When you learn that the person has spoken about you to someone else, that private internal model is suddenly exposed to external interpretation. It is no longer contained. The idea that you exist inside someone else's conversation creates a shift from private emotional connection to social reality, and that shift introduces uncertainty. The mind immediately tries to bridge the gap between what I believe is true and what they might have said. This creates a rapid search for alignment. You begin to reconstruct the possible tone, context, and content of the conversation, but since you were not present, the mind has no direct data, so it relies on imagination. This is where emotional distortion begins. The imagination does not operate neutrally. It is influenced by attachment, insecurity, hope, and fear. So the possible meanings of what was said become emotionally charged rather than factual. At the same time, a secondary process begins: self-referencing. You start evaluating yourself through the imagined lens of their perception. You ask not only what did they say, but how am I seen, and what does that make me? This turns the situation inward. The conversation about you becomes a reflection of your identity rather than just a communication event. Your sense of self temporarily becomes dependent on an unknown narrative outside your control. This creates a split experience. One part of you remains attached to the emotional reality of the connection as you experienced it directly, while another part begins adjusting to a version of the relationship defined by second-hand information. These two versions can conflict. One is based on lived experience, the other on interpreted report. The tension between them produces emotional instability because the mind cannot fully verify either in that moment. Another layer of this experience is the loss of exclusivity. In close emotional bonds, there is often an unconscious sense that the connection exists primarily between two people. When you realize that you are being discussed elsewhere, that sense of exclusivity breaks. The relationship is no longer contained in direct interaction. It now exists in the social space of interpretation. This can trigger feelings of vulnerability because you are no longer fully in control of how you are represented. The intensity of the reaction also comes from uncertainty itself. The human mind tends to prefer incomplete negative certainty over open ambiguity. Not knowing what was said allows multiple possible outcomes to coexist, each carrying emotional weight. The mind cycles through them repeatedly, trying to reduce uncertainty by constructing meaning. In this process, the emotional experience often becomes stronger than the actual content of the conversation. What makes this moment psychologically significant is that it exposes the difference between relational reality and relational perception. You are no longer interacting with the person directly, but with the idea of how you exist in their mental and social space, and that shift creates the internal disturbance that feels so consuming and difficult to stabilize. The mind filling silence with meaning is a natural cognitive process rooted in the way human perception evolved to prioritize pattern recognition over uncertainty. When information is missing, especially in emotionally significant contexts, the brain does not remain neutral. It actively generates interpretations to restore a sense of coherence. Silence, in this sense, is not experienced as nothing, but as an ambiguous signal that demands explanation. The absence of communication becomes a space that the mind instinctively tries to populate. In emotionally neutral situations, silence is usually processed without strong interpretation. But in emotionally charged relationships, silence becomes psychologically loaded. If someone matters to you, their absence of response is no longer just a gap in communication, it becomes a potential message. The brain begins to ask what the silence could mean, and because there is no direct data, it turns inward to construct possibilities. These possibilities are shaped by emotional state, attachment style, past experiences, and current expectations. This process is driven by uncertainty intolerance, which is the discomfort humans feel when outcomes are unclear. The mind seeks resolution, even if that resolution is speculative. So when silence occurs, the brain tries to convert it into something structured: rejection, disinterest, preoccupation, testing, emotional withdrawal, or even deeper hidden meaning. None of these interpretations are confirmed, but each one feels temporarily real because the mind gives emotional weight to imagined explanations. Memory also plays a role in shaping meaning during silence. The brain retrieves past interactions and reevaluates them through the lens of the current gap. Neutral moments from the past may be reinterpreted as signs of distance, while positive moments may be used as evidence of connection. This selective retrieval is not objective. It is guided by emotional need. If the current emotional state leans toward anxiety, memory tends to highlight uncertainty. If it leans toward hope, memory tends to highlight reassurance. Another important factor is narrative construction. The human mind does not store experiences as isolated events. It organizes them into ongoing stories. Silence disrupts the continuity of these stories, so the mind attempts to restore narrative flow by inserting assumptions. Instead of accepting no information, it prefers, "This is probably what is happening." These assumptions then become temporary truths that guide emotional response until new data arrives. Projection also intensifies during silence. Because there is no external input to correct internal interpretation, the mind relies more heavily on its own internal content. This means fears, desires, and expectations become amplified. If someone fears abandonment, silence may feel like confirmation of it. If someone desires closeness, silence may feel like anticipation or emotional tension rather than absence. The same external silence can therefore produce entirely different internal realities depending on the observer's psychological state. Silence also creates space for imagination to become dominant. Without real-time interaction, the mind simulates possible scenarios, what the other person might be doing, thinking, or feeling. These mental simulations are not random. They are influenced by emotional attachment and prior relational patterns. The stronger the emotional investment, the more detailed and emotionally vivid these simulations become. Over time, repeated cycles of silence and interpretation can strengthen internal narratives that feel increasingly real, even if they are not grounded in actual communication. The mind begins to treat its own constructed meaning as insight, not speculation. This is why silence can feel heavy, confusing, or emotionally charged, because it is not truly empty. It is filled with continuously generated interpretation shaped by emotion, memory, and unconscious expectation. Emotional attachment creates an internal split because the mind begins to hold two parallel versions of the same relationship at once: the real-time version based on observable behavior and the internally constructed version shaped by desire, expectation, fear, and interpretation. These two versions rarely remain perfectly aligned, and the tension between them becomes more noticeable as emotional investment increases. The stronger the attachment, the more energy the mind spends maintaining both versions simultaneously. The real version of the relationship is grounded in direct interaction. It consists of actual conversations, visible actions, tone of voice, timing, consistency, and physical or digital presence. It is limited, partial, and sometimes ambiguous, because no interaction can fully express a person's entire emotional reality. However, it is the only version that is objectively shared between two people. The imagined version, however, is constructed internally. It is formed not only from what has happened, but from what the mind believes should happen, what it hopes might happen, and what it fears could happen. This version fills in gaps left by uncertainty. Where communication is unclear, imagination creates clarity. Where behavior is inconsistent, interpretation creates patterns. Where emotional needs are unmet, expectation creates potential outcomes. Over time, this internal model becomes richer, more detailed, and sometimes more emotionally compelling than the actual experience itself. As attachment deepens, the mind begins to emotionally invest in the imagined version as much as, or even more than, the real one. This happens because imagination provides emotional continuity. It allows the person to experience the relationship not only as it is, but as it could be or feels like it should be. This can create emotional comfort, but it also introduces distortion. The internal version of the relationship becomes shaped by psychological needs rather than external reality. The split becomes more visible when reality contradicts expectation. If the other person behaves in a way that does not match the internal narrative, the mind experiences dissonance. This dissonance is not just intellectual, it is emotional. It feels like confusion, disappointment, or even mild shock because the internal model has to be adjusted. Sometimes the mind resists this adjustment by rationalizing behavior to preserve the imagined version. Other times it updates the internal model, but only partially, creating a hybrid version that is neither fully real nor fully imagined. This duality also affects emotional stability. The real version of the relationship changes slowly and unpredictably, while the imagined version can shift rapidly based on mood, hope, or anxiety. This mismatch in stability creates emotional fluctuation. A small positive interaction can temporarily strengthen the imagined version, increasing hope and emotional intensity. A lack of response can strengthen uncertainty, increasing doubt or insecurity. The emotional state begins to oscillate between these internal interpretations. Another layer of this duality comes from identity fusion. In strong attachment, the imagined version of the relationship becomes linked to the sense of self. The person does not only think about the relationship, they also begin to define themselves through it. As a result, any instability in the imagined version feels like instability within the self. This makes emotional separation between reality and imagination even more difficult. Over time, awareness of this split can create a turning point in perception. The mind begins to recognize that what feels emotionally real is not always externally grounded, and what is externally grounded may not fully reflect internal experience. This recognition does not remove the duality, but it makes it visible. And once it becomes visible, the person is no longer fully absorbed in either version, but begins to observe the space between them, where attachment, perception, and imagination continuously interact and reshape emotional experience. Awareness of projection begins when a person starts to notice that their emotional reactions to others are not always directly caused by what the other person is doing, but are often influenced by internal psychological content being activated in response to them. At first, most emotional experiences feel completely external, as if other people are the source of every feeling. Someone says something or remains silent or behaves in a certain way, and the emotional response seems to belong entirely to that external event. But with deeper reflection, a shift occurs where the mind begins to recognize patterns in its own reactions that repeat across different people and situations. This repetition suggests that something internal is being consistently triggered rather than each situation being entirely new. Projection operates by placing inner experiences onto external figures. These inner experiences can include fears, unmet emotional needs, past relational wounds, desires for validation, or unconscious expectations about how relationships should function. When projection is active, the mind does not clearly separate what is being observed from what is being felt internally. Instead, it blends them. A person might believe they are responding to someone's behavior, when in reality, they are also responding to their own internal history being activated by that behavior. The beginning of awareness is subtle. It often appears as a moment of questioning. Instead of immediately accepting an emotional interpretation, the mind starts asking whether the intensity of the feeling matches the situation. For example, a small action from someone might produce a disproportionately strong emotional response. When this mismatch becomes noticeable, it creates a gap between event and reaction. That gap is the space where awareness begins to form. As this awareness deepens, the individual starts observing patterns. They may notice that certain emotional reactions are not unique to one person, but repeat across different relationships. This repetition indicates that the source of the reaction is not fully located in the other person, but in the internal psychological structure of the observer. The other person is acting as a trigger, not the origin. This recognition changes the way emotional experience is understood. Instead of seeing emotions as direct reflections of external reality, they begin to be seen as interactions between external stimuli and internal psychological content. The focus shifts from "what did they do to me" toward "what in me is being activated by this." This does not remove emotional response, but it changes the position of the observer in relation to it. With continued awareness, the mind also begins to distinguish between perception and interpretation. Perception is the raw input, what is actually seen or heard. Interpretation is the meaning assigned to that input. Projection often occurs in the interpretation phase, where neutral or ambiguous signals are given emotional meaning based on internal states. Awareness allows these two layers to be separated, even if only partially at first. This process can initially feel destabilizing because it interrupts automatic emotional narratives. Emotions that once felt absolute begin to appear conditional. Certainty gives way to questioning. But over time, this questioning becomes a form of emotional grounding because it reduces the tendency to fully merge with every interpretation. Instead of being inside the emotional reaction, the person begins to observe it as something happening within them. As awareness strengthens, emotional clarity increases. This does not mean emotions disappear or become weaker. Rather, they become more accurately located. The individual becomes better able to see which parts of their experience are responses to present reality, and which parts are echoes of internal psychological patterns. This separation reduces confusion in relationships because reactions are no longer automatically attributed entirely to the other person. Ultimately, awareness of projection marks the beginning of psychological independence in relationships. It allows a person to remain emotionally engaged while also maintaining internal clarity. The external world is still felt deeply, but it is no longer the sole source of emotional meaning. The mind starts to recognize itself as an active participant in shaping experience, not just a receiver of it.